Hello and welcome to the reboot of my Kerbal Space Program NASA series. With the way things just went terribly wrong with my save file on my previous one, I'm going to do things a little differently this time. I'm going to do the normal edited video, which is just, kind of the plot of the playthrough. And then I'm going to mess around and do more technical, in-depth videos on my flights. Not every flight, just like the first time I do something interesting. I rearranged tech tree on this to give me a couple airplane parts at the very beginning, just some winglets, tail fins, the Mark II cockpit, and the landing gear. It really doesn't make things any easier or harder. It just, I think starting out with the X1, X15 type thing would be a little more interesting and true to history. I've got the NACA emblem on my vehicles at this point, which is the predecessor to NASA. But here we have lead test pilot Jebediah Kerman taking the X1 prototype out on taxi trials. Noting that it's a little unstable with the narrow landing gear track. Engines firing normally. Brakes functioning as required. Decides to do a couple more observations. Do an external systems check. And just give his thoughts on the general area. Little Unity bug where the wheels tend to, it seems like they get stuck in a divot almost, but I know that's not what it is. It's just a little glitch in the code. Continuing to taxi down the runway. Very unstable. Whoa. Just gotta gently tap on the brakes, slow it down a bit. Try to make the turn towards the VAB. Nope, nope, nope. And the Kerbal Space Program's first prototype space plane flops over on the runway. Basically, that's just me trying to get early ground science so I can unlock a couple more parts before I really get rolling. I've tried every possible permutation, and I wasn't able to get enough science to unlock spaceplane parts before I do a Mercury-style mission. So I went into, I had to resort to editing, doing a hardware check. Testing the soil around the launch pad, or the landing recovery something thing, runway. Quick observations of the launch pad that is being provided to them. Start unlocking some science. And this is 64-bit, so I've got a royal load of mods. I haven't had any real problems with 64-bit, and that includes running it for several hours in one playthrough. So it just, if you can get the game to start, it'll crash on load, and I'll get a crash sometimes on a scene change. But that's just continuing some boring ground observations. Unlock one more node. And let's hire some more. Get our Moho 7. Sadly, this was not a playthrough where I was able to get Gus Kerman right off the bat. And a quick redesign of our spaceplane later. And this thing might... You can actually fly with just winglets and a small enough aircraft with enough thrust. go fast enough, you don't really need wings. It's pretty easy to handle little jet, well, rocket. Let's head out for our first test flight. Wasting no time in getting to it, Jebediah guns the throttle. Grits his teeth, tightens his silk scarf, and pops it up into the air. And just for a little extra flavor, I'm running the Final Frontier mod, which gives ribbons and decorations to your Kerbals for outstanding performance. It's really just a way of taking note of milestones. But Jebediah has his sights firmly set on the sound barrier, and he will not rest until he has surpassed it. Tight, extreme maneuver there. And at this point, it's time to lock the nose forward and fire all the throttles. Playing with Ferrum Aerospace, which is all sorts of interesting. With the latest versions, they've reinstituted high dynamic stresses, so you will rip the wings clean off your planes. Even this little thing. Struts can help alleviate it somewhat, but if you're trying to pull 5 or 6 Gs at Mach 1 below 5,000 meters, you're going to lose your airplane. And at these speeds, with such a finicky aircraft, the far flight assistance systems are really not all that useful. I still don't have a definitive answer as to whether or not landing gear produces drag. I do believe they're still physics-less objects, even in Ferrum. At this point, it's decided to abandon the Ferrum flight assist options and just rely on SAS, otherwise known as the mech jet of the skies. Trying to get worried about my center of balance, so I bring up TAC fuel balancer. Flare. I've got a little bit of fuel left. Maybe I can make it back to the Space Center. I've always been an optimist. Oh, too close, too close, too close. Having to be very gentle because this will flip out and stall at the slightest provocation. At this point, Jebediah starts wondering, where the heck am I? Aha! Relying on guidance from ground control, which how they're picking up on radar through that hill is anyone's guess. Just trying to keep forward velocity up, keep from stalling out. That is the Vessel Viewer mod. It integrates with raster prop monitor to give a top-down MFD display of your aircraft or rocket. For your rocket, it's generally going to be a side-on view. You can just barely see the Space Center. At this point, it starts becoming blatantly obvious I'm not going to make it. But there's always hope. Engine cutout dashes that hope. And so preparations have to begin for an emergency landing off the field. Thankfully, the planes around here are pretty gentle, although turning back to the Space Center put me in more hilly terrain. Would have been better off touching down further out. And I am not flying with the flight stick at this point. I've moved my desktop to another room so I can be more sociable while I mess with it. And that usually precludes me moving stick, throttle, and rudder pedals down with me. Keep that vertical speed down. Flare. Oh! Drogue chutes deployed. Clips off the stabilizer. But the world rejoices with the first breaking of the sound barrier in level flight by a exceedingly brave and/or stupid Kerbal. Brave for making the effort, but you'll have to be stupid to climb into anything I design. Gauge the brakes. Do some quick ground observations while we're out here. One design oversight, the aircraft does not have a ladder to reach the ground with. And here we see the ribbons Jebediah has been awarded for outstanding service. Gathered some science. Recovered almost the total value of the ship. And now it's time to set that record. Try and accomplish these first 4 contracts. And I'm waiting a couple days between my aircraft launches. My rocket launches are going to be spaced 1 month apart, or 1 human month. I was thinking that my timescales are off. Pretty straightforward mission we've asked Jebediah to perform here. Just gently raise the nose so we don't rip the wings off. Leave that throttle firewalled. The real Bell X1, and this flight is actually more X-15 than X1, but the real X1 and X-15 were obvious, if anyone, most people remember this, but they were dropped by bombers. They were carried up piggyback. They didn't have anywhere near the endurance that you can build even just a simple rocket plane like this with in Kerbal Space Program. They had to be carried up to a high altitude and dropped. And the X1, funnily enough, was actually, apart from the body, which was built to resemble a M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun bullet, which was known to be stable in supersonic flight, beyond that, the aircraft was pretty much unsuited in any way, shape, or form for supersonic flight. It had completely straight wings until a technology exchange was done with the British. It didn't even have an all-moving tailplane, which led to compressibility problems. The faster you went, the higher the dynamic pressure over your control surfaces became, and the amount of force required to move it would pretty much exceed anything that a human could deliver. So, a lot of interesting and important things were learned during the X1 program, mainly that straight wings and non-all-moving tailplanes are not a good idea when you're going supersonic. But the X-15 was a whole other beast. To this day, it holds the record for being the fastest self-powered rocket plane in history. The space shuttle on re-entry was faster, but that's because it was coming back from orbital velocity, not because it propelled. I mean, it does propel itself to a certain extent, but the solid rocket boosters, I believe, are what disqualify it from holding any velocity records for aircraft, especially because in launch, the space shuttle's really not in an aerodynamic flight scheme. It's very much being launched like a rocket. Do our first EVAs in space. Jebediah is well aware that his aircraft doesn't have the punch to get himself into stable orbit. But much like the real X-15 pilots, he earns his space wings. And there were a couple flights in the X-15 where pilots experienced weightlessness and reached the minimum altitude required to get their astronaut wings. And interestingly enough, the Air Force test pilots who accomplished this were given their astronaut wings pretty much right off the bat. If I remember correctly, the civilian test pilots didn't get theirs until the 2000s, for whatever various reasons. But the X-15 was an incredible machine. I believe some models had RCS thrusters added so they could maneuver in space, because they were pretty much one of the first spacecraft. I'm fuzzy on my dates. I don't believe they reached space before Yuri Gagarin or Alan Shepard. I could be wrong, but I highly doubt it. They even observed re-entry heating on a couple flights. And this is where you run into one of the big drawbacks in Kerbal Space Program. Just testing around Edwards Air Force Base and just how much larger Earth is than Kerbin. They could go up to the edge of space and still touch down at Edwards Air Base. I launched Jeb here into the edge of the atmosphere, and I'm halfway around the globe before I come back. Which would explain the large parachutes on the midsection of the aircraft, since there's not really a whole lot of places to land, and I knew my fuel would be expended. It's just going to be parachute recovery. We go checking to make sure Jeb gets his speed and altitude records, and that's a problem with Final Frontier. It can't really differentiate between a re-entry velocity and straight line velocity sometimes, especially because I'm doing my best to confuse it right now. I've brought my nose angle up above my flight path marker, and you'll notice my wings are actually generating lift, and you see that prograde marker coming up to meet my attitude indicator. Actually using the aerodynamics of this plane to arrest my downward velocity, because I think that was a steep enough return. I would have burned something off on the way down. Bring the nose up a little higher. And then actually start gaining altitude again. I don't have any RCS on this. Obviously you don't see any ports, but it would probably be useful if I could ever give it enough punch to get straight into orbit, which I'm not going to be doing. We'll be trying to keep this somewhat historically accurate. And once it becomes clear we're safely on our return, pop the chutes and take the long weight down. The ship's almost perfectly balanced, so it'll come down level. The drogue chutes deploy. Down in the water. Nothing breaks, which is always good. with no external batteries, the longevity on this ship is extremely limited, and that's why I'm using the KW engine instead of the LV909. The LV909 does not have an alternator, and with TAC Life support, I wouldn't stay up long enough for the battery charge to cause any problems, but the LV909, while it's firing, will keep me topped up on charge, and that'll give me plenty of time for whatever flight envelope this thing's capable of. The successful completion of our first 3 contracts with the X-15 program. Another bug, landing in water gives you a Mach 10 in level flight award. Another Final Frontier bug. I'm going to have to check, see if they fixed that. But head back into the Science Center and start choosing things for unlock. I think I will get my greatest return out of Science Tech. It seems like a good a place as any to end, and we will catch back up on the next episode.